Picture this. You're scrolling through social media when you see a headline about a former president getting arrested. Your first thought might be shock, but here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Throughout American history, there have been presidents who committed acts so outrageous, so blatantly criminal, that by today's standards, they absolutely should have been thrown behind bars. We're talking about leaders who violated the Constitution, committed war crimes, and engaged in corruption that would make modern politicians blush. Today, we're diving deep into the dark underbelly of presidential history to uncover the commanders-in-chief who deserved handcuffs instead of honors. Before we get started, let me be crystal clear about something. This isn't about political parties or picking sides. This is about objective facts, documented crimes, and constitutional violations that transcend party lines. Some of these stories are so shocking, you'll wonder how these men ever made it into the Oval Office in the first place. Let's start with a name that might surprise you: Andrew Jackson. Now, most people know Jackson as the guy on the $20 bill, but what they don't know is that he was basically a walking crime spree in a presidential suit. Jackson's most heinous act was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forcibly relocated tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. But here's the kicker: the Supreme Court actually ruled against Jackson's policy in Worcester versus Georgia. His response? He allegedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." That's right, folks. Jackson straight up ignored a Supreme Court ruling, which is essentially giving the middle finger to one of the fundamental pillars of our democracy. But the Trail of Tears wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was ethnic cleansing. Thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people died during forced marches to designated Indian territory. Men, women, and children perished from exposure, disease, and starvation, while federal troops herded them like cattle across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain. By any modern legal standard, this would constitute crimes against humanity. Jackson knew people would die, approved the policy anyway, and then celebrated when it was carried out. And that's just the beginning of Jackson's criminal resume. This guy fought over 100 duels, killed at least one man in cold blood, and once beat an attempted assassin nearly to death with his walking cane on the steps of the Capitol. Imagine if a modern president responded to criticism by challenging people to gunfights at dawn. Jackson would have been impeached before his first State of the Union address. Moving on to another shocker, Warren Harding, who ran what was essentially a criminal enterprise from the White House. Harding's administration was so corrupt that it makes Watergate look like a parking ticket. The Teapot Dome scandal alone should have landed him in federal prison. His Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for massive bribes. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in 1920s money, which would be millions today. But Fall was just one member of what Harding called the Ohio Gang, a collection of poker buddies and party friends who treated the federal government like their personal piggy bank. The head of the Veterans Bureau embezzled millions of dollars that were supposed to help wounded World War I soldiers. Let that sink in for a moment. They were stealing money from disabled veterans who had sacrificed their bodies for their country. If that doesn't make your blood boil, I don't know what will. Harding's attorney general was taking kickbacks to ignore criminal activity during Prohibition. The man whose job it was to enforce federal law was literally being paid by criminals to look the other way. And while all this theft and corruption was happening, Harding himself was golfing, gambling, and drinking illegal alcohol in the White House. The hypocrisy is staggering. He was breaking the very laws his administration was supposed to enforce. Here's where it gets even more insane. Harding once admitted to a friend, "I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies in a fight. But my damn friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floors at nights." Even he knew his administration was a den of thieves, but he did nothing to stop it. In any other context, this would be called running a criminal conspiracy. Now let's talk about Richard Nixon, the only president in history forced to resign from office. Nixon's crimes weren't just limited to Watergate. That was merely the tip of the iceberg. This guy ran an administration that read like a handbook for authoritarian rule. The break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters was just one small part of a massive campaign to spy on, harass, and sabotage political opponents. Nixon maintained an enemies list of journalists, politicians, and activists who dared to criticize him. His administration used the IRS to target political opponents with audits and investigations. They wiretapped phones, broke into offices, and planted listening devices. Nixon even ordered the firebombing of the Brookings Institution because he thought they had documents that could damage him politically. When that didn't happen, he had operatives burglarize their offices instead. The Watergate tapes revealed Nixon personally orchestrating a cover-up that involved perjury, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. He offered executive clemency to the Watergate burglars in exchange for their silence. He authorized payments of hush money to keep witnesses quiet. He ordered his staff to lie to Congress, the FBI, and federal prosecutors. These aren't political mistakes. These are felonies that would send any ordinary citizen to prison for decades. But here's what really gets me fired up. Nixon's secret bombing campaign in Cambodia during the Vietnam War. Without congressional approval or public knowledge, Nixon ordered over 3,600 bombing sorties that killed thousands of civilians. This wasn't just unconstitutional, it was a war crime under international law. The bombing destabilized Cambodia and contributed directly to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, one of the most murderous regimes in human history. Speaking of war crimes, let's discuss Franklin Pierce, whose actions directly contributed to the bloodshed known as Bleeding Kansas. Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed settlers in those territories to vote on whether to allow slavery. Sounds democratic, right? Wrong. Pierce knew this would lead to violence, and when pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas with rifles and torches, he did worse than nothing. He actively supported the pro-slavery side. When pro-slavery forces established an illegitimate government through voter fraud and intimidation, Pierce recognized it as legitimate and sent federal troops to enforce its authority. He was essentially using the United States Army to enforce the results of a rigged election. Houses were burned, families were slaughtered, and the territory descended into a 5-year civil war that killed hundreds of people. Pierce's response was to pour more gasoline on the fire by backing the most extreme pro-slavery faction. This wasn't incompetence. This was criminal negligence at best and active conspiracy at worst. Pierce knew his policies would lead to violence and death, but he pursued them anyway because they served his political interests. In today's legal system, he could be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, depriving citizens of their civil rights under color of law, and seditious conspiracy. Now let's turn our attention to James Buchanan, who didn't just fail to prevent the Civil War, he actively helped cause it. Buchanan's fingerprints are all over the Dred Scott decision, one of the most shameful rulings in Supreme Court history. Behind the scenes, Buchanan pressured Supreme Court justices to issue a sweeping pro-slavery ruling that declared African Americans could never be united. States' citizens. Think about the implications here. The President of the United States secretly colluded with Supreme Court justices to issue a predetermined ruling that stripped basic human rights from millions of people. This wasn't just judicial misconduct. It was a conspiracy to violate the constitutional rights of American citizens. Buchanan literally helped rig a Supreme Court case to advance his political agenda. When Southern states began seceding after Lincoln's election, Buchanan claimed he had no authority to stop them. But that's complete nonsense. The Constitution explicitly gives the president the power to enforce federal law and suppress insurrections. Buchanan had the legal authority and constitutional duty to prevent secession, but he chose not to act because he sympathized with the South's position on slavery. By the time Buchanan left office, 7 states had seceded, federal property had been seized, and the country was sliding toward civil war. His inaction wasn't just incompetence. It was a deliberate abdication of his constitutional responsibilities that bordered on treason. Here's one that'll really shock you. Woodrow Wilson, often praised for his progressive ideals, ran what was essentially a police state during World War I. Wilson signed the Espionage Act and Sedition Act, which made it a federal crime to criticize the government, the military, or even the American flag. Under his administration, over 2,000 Americans were prosecuted for expressing their opinions. We're talking about journalists thrown in prison for writing articles critical of the war effort. Union leaders were arrested for organizing strikes. Ordinary citizens were imprisoned for making jokes about the president. Wilson's Justice Department conducted massive raids, arresting thousands of suspected radicals without warrants or due process. This wasn't wartime necessity. This was systematic suppression of the First Amendment. The Palmer raids, named after Wilson's attorney general, were essentially American gulags. Federal agents swept through immigrant communities, arresting anyone suspected of having radical political views. They were held without charges, denied legal representation, and many were deported without trial. These weren't enemy combatants. They were American residents whose only crime was having unpopular political opinions. Wilson also revegregated the federal government, reversing decades of progress in civil rights. He held private screenings of Birth of a Nation, a film that glorified the Ku Klux Klan, in the White House. When African-American veterans returned from fighting for democracy in Europe, Wilson's administration stood by while they faced lynchings and race riots across the country. But here's where Wilson's crimes get truly international. His insistence on harsh terms for Germany in the Treaty of Versailles directly contributed to the economic conditions that allowed Adolf Hitler to rise to power. Wilson wasn't just present at the negotiations, he was one of the primary architects of a peace treaty, so punitive that it virtually guaranteed another world war. The man who promised to make the world safe for democracy helped create the conditions for fascism. Now let's talk about Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's assassination and immediately began undermining everything Lincoln had died for. Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would have granted citizenship and basic rights to formerly enslaved people. When Congress overrode his veto, Johnson found other ways to sabotage Reconstruction. Johnson issued mass pardons to tens of thousands of Confederate leaders, allowing them to regain political power in the South. Think about this. People who had literally taken up arms against the United States, who had committed treason by any reasonable definition, were welcomed back into the political system with open arms. Meanwhile, the African Americans who had supported the Union were left defenseless against the very people who had enslaved them. Johnson's policies directly led to the establishment of Jim Crow laws and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. He knew that restoring Confederate leaders to power would result in violence and oppression against African Americans, but he did it anyway. This wasn't just bad policy, it was a deliberate conspiracy to deny civil rights to American citizens based on their race. The fact that Johnson survived his impeachment trial by just one vote shows how close we came to holding him accountable for his crimes, but his acquittal allowed him to continue undermining Reconstruction and betraying the principles that hundreds of thousands of Americans had died to defend. Let's not forget about Herbert Hoover's criminal negligence during the Great Depression, when 15,000 World War I veterans marched peacefully on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of bonuses they had been promised. Hoover's response was to send in the army with tanks, tear gas, and bayonets. These weren't rioters or revolutionaries. They were American veterans who had served their country and were now desperate for help during the worst economic crisis in our nation's history. The Bonus Army incident wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was a criminal assault on American citizens exercising their constitutional right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Federal troops burned down the veterans' encampment, injuring dozens and killing at least 2 people. Hoover personally authorized the use of military force against American veterans on American soil. This was a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the use of military forces for domestic law enforcement. Hoover literally broke federal law by ordering the Army to attack American citizens. The images of tanks and soldiers assaulting veterans created a scandal that helped ensure Hoover's defeat in the next election, but he was never held legally accountable for his crimes. George W. Bush presents one of the most complex cases because many of his potentially criminal acts were committed in the name of national security after September 11th. But good intentions don't excuse violations of law and human rights. Bush authorized a torture program that violated both American law and international treaties that the United States had signed and ratified. The CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques included waterboarding, prolonged stress positions, sexual humiliation, and psychological torture. These methods were used not just on confirmed terrorists, but on suspects who were never charged with any crime. Some detainees were tortured to death. Others were driven insane by the treatment they received. Bush also authorized massive surveillance programs that violated the Fourth Amendment rights of American citizens. The NSA was collecting phone records, emails, and internet communications without warrants or judicial oversight. When whistleblowers tried to expose these programs through proper channels, they were prosecuted and imprisoned. The invasion of Iraq, based on fabricated evidence of weapons of mass destruction, represents another potential crime. Bush and his administration knowingly made false statements to Congress and the American people to justify a war that killed over 4,400 American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. If those weren't war crimes, they were at least criminal fraud on a massive scale. Throughout this dark journey through presidential history, one pattern becomes crystal clear: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. These presidents weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches. They were human beings who allowed their positions to corrupt their judgment and compromise their morals. They convinced themselves that their crimes were necessary, that the ends justified the means, that they were above the law. But that's exactly why we need to remember these stories and learn from them. Democracy only works when we hold our leaders accountable, regardless of their party affiliation or their place in history. The moment we start making excuses for criminal behavior by presidents is the moment we begin losing our democracy. The founders of our country understood this, which is why they included impeachment in the Constitution and insisted that no one, not even the president, is above the law. They had experienced tyranny firsthand and knew that unchecked power inevitably leads to abuse and corruption. What makes these historical crimes even more disturbing is how many of them were committed in broad daylight, with the full knowledge of Congress, the press, and the American people. These weren't secret conspiracies hidden from public view. They were public policies supported by millions of Americans who should have known better. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth about American democracy. We are all complicit when we allow our leaders to commit crimes in our name. Every time we make excuses for criminal behavior because we support a particular president's policies, we become accessories to their crimes. Every time we turn a blind eye to constitutional violations because they serve our political interests, we undermine the rule of law. The presidents on this list didn't operate in a vacuum. They had supporters, enablers, and apologists who helped them commit their crimes and escape accountability. They had political parties that prioritized loyalty over law and order. They had media outlets that defended their actions and attacked their critics. Sound familiar? It should, because these same dynamics continue to operate in American politics today. We see politicians defending obviously criminal behavior when it's committed by members of their own party. We see media outlets spinning obvious lies into alternative facts. We see voters supporting candidates who openly promise to violate the Constitution and ignore the rule of law. The lesson here isn't that all presidents are criminals. Many of our commanders-in-chief have been honest, principled leaders who respected the law and the Constitution. The lesson is that we must remain vigilant against the corruption of power and demand accountability from our leaders, regardless of their party affiliation. We must reject the false choice between effective leadership and lawful behavior. A president can be strong and decisive while still respecting constitutional limits on their authority. They can protect national security without torturing prisoners or spying on American citizens without warrants. They can pursue their policy agenda without breaking the law or violating their oath of office. The presidents who should have been arrested teach us that no one, no matter how powerful or popular, is above the law. They remind us that democracy is fragile and must be constantly defended against those who would abuse their power for personal or political gain. Most importantly, they show us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We must always be ready to hold our leaders accountable, even when it's politically inconvenient or personally uncomfortable. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, we must remember that the rule of law is not a partisan issue. It's the foundation of our entire system of government. Without it, we have no democracy, no freedom, and no justice. The presidents who violated their oaths of office and escaped accountability serve as a warning of what happens when we allow power to go unchecked. The next time you hear someone defending criminal behavior by a president, remember these stories. Remember that patriotism means holding our leaders to the highest standards, not making excuses for their worst behavior. Remember that true loyalty to America means defending the Constitution and the rule of law, even when it's difficult or unpopular. These presidents should have been arrested, not because they were bad people, but because they committed serious crimes that harmed our democracy and violated the trust placed in them by the American people. By learning from their failures and demanding better from our current and future leaders, we can help ensure that such crimes are never again committed in our name or with our consent. The choice is ours. We can continue to make excuses for criminal behavior by our political leaders, or we can demand accountability and restore faith in American democracy. The presidents who should have been arrested remind us that this choice has consequences, and the future of our country depends on making the right one.